There was a time when a single man operating from the mist-covered mountains of Southeast Asia was widely reported to influence the flow of narcotics across continents, shaping global heroin markets from deep within one of the most remote and politically complex regions on Earth. His name was Khun Sa, and at the height of his power, he stood at the center of the Golden Triangle, a region where the borders of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand converge in rugged terrain that for decades proved nearly impossible to fully control. From these highlands, surrounded by shifting alliances, ethnic insurgencies, and fragile state authority, Khun Sa built a network that would make him one of the most talked-about figures in the history of the global opium trade. To understand how he rose to such prominence, it is necessary to begin not with the drugs themselves, but with geography, conflict, and opportunity. Because Khun Sa's story is inseparable from the mountains that shielded him and the political fractures that allowed him to thrive. Born in 1934 in what was then British Burma, in the Shan state region of what is now Myanmar, Khun Sa entered a world already shaped by colonial administration, ethnic tension, and limited central control over distant borderlands. The Shan state, home to various ethnic groups including the Shan people, had long existed at the margins of national authority, and after Burma gained independence in 1948, the central government struggled to assert consistent control over these territories. Ethnic militias, local warlords, and insurgent groups emerged, each pursuing their own agendas, sometimes aligning with the state and sometimes resisting it. In this fragmented environment, power often flowed to those who could command armed men and secure territory, and Khun Sa would eventually learn to navigate this landscape with calculated precision. During the early years of his rise, the region that would become known globally as the Golden Triangle was already producing opium, but it was the convergence of political instability, demand from international markets, and porous borders that transformed it into a major hub. The Golden Triangle, defined by the meeting point of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, offered natural defenses in the form of steep mountains, dense forests, and limited infrastructure. Roads were scarce, state presence was inconsistent, and many communities relied on subsistence agriculture, including opium poppy cultivation, which had been grown in the region for generations. Opium was not initially produced with global trafficking networks in mind. For many local farmers, it was a cash crop suited to high-altitude climates and easy to transport in small quantities. But as global demand for heroin expanded during the mid-20th century, the economic potential of controlling production and trafficking routes grew exponentially. Khun Sa recognized that controlling territory in Shan State meant controlling access to both cultivation zones and the routes that moved opium across borders. In his early career, he formed armed groups that initially positioned themselves within the broader web of ethnic militias operating in the region. At times, he cooperated with the Myanmar government in counterinsurgency efforts against rival groups, a strategy that provided him with space to consolidate influence. By aligning tactically with state forces when convenient, he gained legitimacy and operational freedom, allowing him to build networks and expand his armed presence. Over time, his militia evolved into a more organized force, heavily armed and structured, capable of defending territory and enforcing authority over key areas of opium production. The strength of Khun Sa's organization lay not only in firepower, but also in its layered strategy. He understood that to dominate the opium trade, he needed more than farmers and caravans. He needed secure zones, disciplined fighters, and reliable alliances. By establishing bases in remote mountain strongholds, he created logistical hubs that were difficult for adversaries to penetrate. These strongholds served as centers for coordination, protection of cultivation zones, and defense against both rival traffickers and government offensives. His militia, often referred to as the Mong Thai Army during its most prominent phase, operated with a command structure that resembled a conventional military force, complete with ranks, training, and territorial divisions. This organizational discipline allowed Khun Sa to present himself not merely as a trafficker, but as a political and military leader representing Shan interests, a narrative that complicated efforts to categorize and confront him. As his influence expanded through the 1970s and 1980s, international observers increasingly linked Khun Sa to a significant share of the world's opium supply. Reports circulated that he controlled a large portion of production flowing out of the Golden Triangle, though exact figures were difficult to verify due to the clandestine nature of the trade. What is clear is that his network became deeply embedded in the regional economy. Farmers cultivated poppies under the protection of his forces, intermediaries processed raw opium, and trafficking routes carried the product across borders into Thailand and beyond, eventually feeding into global distribution channels. The scale of operations required coordination across multiple layers, from cultivation to refinement to transport. And Khun Sa's ability to oversee this system demonstrated both strategic planning and adaptability. Geography remained his greatest ally. The mountains of Shan State and the surrounding borderlands limited the mobility of large government forces. Helicopter operations were constrained by weather and terrain, and ground offensives required navigating narrow paths vulnerable to ambush. Supply lines for state militaries stretched thin, while Khun Sa's forces, familiar with the terrain and supported by local networks, could move swiftly and disappear when necessary. This imbalance allowed his organization to survive repeated enforcement efforts. Governments in the region, including Myanmar and Thailand, launched operations aimed at curbing trafficking and dismantling militias, but these campaigns often collided with broader political considerations. In some cases, authorities prioritized counterinsurgency against other groups, creating shifting alliances that temporarily reduced pressure on Khun Sa's network. The interplay between narcotics control and political strategy created a complex environment in which enforcement was rarely straightforward. International agencies, particularly from the United States, monitored the Golden Triangle with growing concern as heroin from Southeast Asia entered global markets. During the latter half of the 20th century, heroin consumption in parts of the world rose sharply, and attention turned toward major production zones. Khun Sa became a prominent name in reports and media coverage, portrayed as a central figure in a vast narcotics empire. Yet efforts to capture or neutralize him faced obstacles not only from terrain and armed resistance, but from the intricate web of regional politics. The Myanmar government itself faced numerous internal conflicts, balancing ceasefires, offensives, and negotiations with various ethnic armed organizations. Within this environment, eliminating one powerful militia risked destabilizing fragile arrangements elsewhere. Khun Sa capitalized on these tensions by positioning himself as both a businessman and a political actor. He occasionally framed his operations as a means of supporting Shan autonomy, arguing that the opium trade funded resistance and local governance in neglected regions. This narrative resonated with some local communities who viewed central authority as distant or oppressive. By intertwining economic activity with ethnic identity and political aspiration, he created layers of legitimacy that extended beyond simple criminal enterprise. His ability to maintain support, or at least tolerance, among segments of the population further insulated his operations from disruption. At the height of his power, Khun Sa's organization maintained extensive networks that spanned borders. Trafficking routes moved through Thailand, where corruption and logistical challenges sometimes hindered enforcement. From there, shipments entered broader international channels, ultimately reaching markets far from the mountains where the poppies were grown. Each stage of this journey involved risk, negotiation, and coordination, and maintaining continuity required constant adaptation. Rival groups sought to carve out their own shares of the trade, and competition could be fierce. Khun Sa's response combined deterrence with diplomacy, using both force and alliance building to secure his position. His militia engaged in clashes when necessary, but also entered into arrangements that reduced conflict and stabilized supply lines. The scale of reported production during this era drew global attention, with some estimates suggesting that the Golden Triangle accounted for a significant portion of worldwide opium output. Within that context, Khun Sa's name became synonymous with the region's narcotics trade. However, it is important to recognize that the opium economy involved thousands of participants at multiple levels, from smallholder farmers to cross-border intermediaries. While Khun Sa exerted substantial influence, the system was not a single monolithic structure, but a network of overlapping interests. His prominence reflected his ability to sit at a critical junction within that network, coordinating protection, transport, and negotiation across territories that few others could effectively manage. As enforcement pressure increased in the 1980s, particularly from international actors seeking to curb heroin flows, Khun Sa adapted by refining his political messaging and strengthening his military posture. He granted interviews to foreign journalists, presenting himself as a nationalist leader rather than a trafficker, and even proposed arrangements that would have involved selling opium crops directly to governments under certain conditions. These overtures were controversial and rarely taken seriously by authorities, but they illustrated his awareness of global scrutiny and his willingness to engage in unconventional strategies to maintain leverage. By blending public relations with armed deterrence, he prolonged his relevance on the international stage. The persistence of his network despite sustained pressure underscored the structural challenges of combating narcotics operations embedded within conflict zones. Remote terrain, limited infrastructure, and competing political priorities created an environment where enforcement required more than simple raids or arrests. It demanded long-term stability, alternative economic opportunities for farmers, and coordinated regional cooperation, all of which proved difficult to achieve simultaneously. Khun Sa's rise was therefore not only a story of individual ambition, but a reflection of systemic gaps that allowed such influence to flourish. His dominance over key segments of the opium trade during his peak years demonstrated how geography, military organization, and strategic alliances could combine to shape global markets from the periphery of state power. As Part 1 of this exploration concludes, the foundations of Khun Sa's ascent stand clear. A volatile borderland, a valuable crop, an organized militia, and a leader who understood how to navigate the space between rebellion and negotiation. In the next phase of his story, these elements would be tested by intensified crackdowns, internal fractures, and evolving regional dynamics that would ultimately challenge the durability of his control over the Golden Triangle's opium economy. As pressure intensified around the Golden Triangle, and international scrutiny sharpened its focus on the mountainous frontier where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand converge, Khun Sa entered the most complex and precarious phase of his dominance, a period defined not only by the scale of his operations but by the mounting determination of governments and global agencies to dismantle them. By the mid-1980s, his name had become synonymous with the region's narcotics economy, and reports portraying him as one of the most influential figures in the global opium trade circulated widely. Yet power at that level carried exposure, and exposure brought sustained attention from authorities determined to curtail the flow of heroin reaching distant markets. What made the campaign against him uniquely difficult was not simply the scale of cultivation or the number of armed fighters under his command, but the entanglement of his organization within a broader landscape of ethnic insurgency, fragile ceasefires, and cross-border political sensitivities. The Golden Triangle was never a vacuum. It was a contested arena in which multiple armed actors operated simultaneously, each with their own objectives, and enforcement efforts had to navigate this intricate mosaic without igniting wider instability. Khun Sa's militia, commonly known during its most prominent years as the Mong Thai Army, had evolved into a force numbering in the thousands, equipped with small arms, fortified positions, and a command structure that allowed coordinated defense across dispersed mountain territories. These fighters were not merely guards for poppy fields. They functioned as a territorial authority in areas where central governance was minimal or absent. Roads were monitored, checkpoints were established, and local communities interacted daily with Khun Sa's network, whether through economic ties or security arrangements. This embedded presence meant that dismantling his operations required far more than seizing shipments. It required penetrating and displacing a parallel power structure rooted in geography and sustained by revenue. Regional governments faced conflicting priorities. The government of Myanmar confronted numerous ethnic armed organizations across different states, each presenting its own political and military challenge. Resources were finite, and campaigns against one group could inadvertently strengthen another. In some periods, ceasefire agreements with certain factions shifted military focus elsewhere, creating windows during which Khun Sa's network could consolidate or reposition. Thailand, positioned as a key transit corridor, grappled with border security concerns and the complexities of policing remote mountain crossings. While Thai authorities conducted operations to intercept trafficking routes, corruption and logistical constraints complicated sustained enforcement. Laos, also sharing part of the Golden Triangle, dealt with its own internal dynamics and limited capacity to project force consistently into rugged frontier zones. Against this backdrop, international agencies, particularly from the United States, pressed for more coordinated action. Heroin originating in Southeast Asia had contributed significantly to global supply during previous decades, and curbing production at its source became a strategic objective. Intelligence gathering intensified, satellite imagery improved, and diplomatic engagement sought to encourage joint operations. Yet coordination across sovereign states, each managing internal conflicts and political calculations, proved slow and uneven. Efforts to target Khun Sa directly often collided with the reality that his strongholds were located deep within contested territory, where any large-scale offensive risked prolonged conflict and humanitarian consequences for civilian populations living nearby. Khun Sa responded to mounting pressure with a blend of defiance and strategic messaging. He cultivated an image that blurred the line between insurgent leader and narcotics trafficker, framing his activities as intertwined with Shan aspirations for greater autonomy. By invoking ethnic identity and regional grievances, he sought to position himself within a political narrative that complicated external portrayals of him solely as a criminal figure. This approach did not erase the narcotics dimension of his operations, but it did resonate with segments of local communities who perceived central authority as distant or unresponsive. The revenues generated from opium cultivation funded not only arms purchases and logistical networks, but also administrative functions within territories under his control. In this sense, the narcotics economy underwrote a quasi-governance structure, reinforcing the durability of his presence. Meanwhile, the global heroin market itself was evolving. Competing production zones, including those in Southwest Asia, influenced price fluctuations and demand patterns. These shifts affected incentives for cultivation within the Golden Triangle, and Khun Sa's organization had to adapt to changing market conditions while maintaining territorial security. Processing facilities capable of refining opium into heroin operated in concealed locations, adding another layer of complexity to enforcement efforts. Destroying poppy fields addressed only one component of the supply chain. Intercepting precursor chemicals, dismantling laboratories, and disrupting transport corridors required sustained intelligence and cross-border cooperation. Each stage involved different actors and vulnerabilities, and Khun Sa's network survived by distributing risk across multiple nodes, rather than concentrating it in a single, easily targeted hub. Military confrontations periodically erupted as Myanmar's armed forces launched offensives aimed at weakening his territorial control. These campaigns tested the resilience of the Mong Thai army, which relied on familiarity with terrain and flexible defensive tactics. Ambushes, fortified hill positions, and rapid dispersal into forested areas enabled his fighters to avoid decisive defeat. However, sustained pressure strained resources and morale. Maintaining thousands of armed personnel required steady revenue, and any disruption in trafficking or cultivation could ripple through the organization. The balance between projecting strength and avoiding overextension became increasingly delicate. At the same time, internal dynamics within the Shan armed landscape introduced new challenges. Rival factions and splinter groups questioned Khun Sa's leadership and strategic direction. Allegations circulated that personal ambition and financial interests sometimes overshadowed broader political goals, fueling dissent among commanders and rank-and-file members. Managing cohesion within a large militia demanded not only funding, but also a compelling vision, and cracks within the structure signaled potential vulnerabilities that external forces might exploit. The more expansive the organization became, the harder it was to maintain unified discipline across dispersed mountain bases. International diplomatic efforts continued to spotlight the Golden Triangle as a priority in global narcotics control. Development programs aimed at crop substitution sought to provide farmers with alternatives to opium cultivation, introducing new agricultural techniques and market access initiatives. Yet such programs faced formidable obstacles. The profitability and portability of opium, combined with entrenched networks offering protection and guaranteed purchase, made transition risky for farmers dependent on consistent income. Without reliable infrastructure, transportation, and long-term economic support, alternative crops struggled to compete. Khun Sa's ability to guarantee security and payment reinforced loyalty among cultivators, even as eradication campaigns intensified. As the 1990s approached, the regional political environment began to shift in ways that would gradually reshape the calculus for all armed actors in Shan State. The Myanmar government pursued ceasefire arrangements with various ethnic groups, seeking to reduce active conflict and consolidate authority. These agreements altered alliances and redefined incentives. For Khun Sa, negotiating with central authorities posed both opportunity and risk. A settlement could preserve personal safety and financial assets, but it might require disbanding or integrating his militia, thereby relinquishing direct control over the territories that had anchored his influence. Continuing armed resistance, on the other hand, meant enduring sustained military pressure and the possibility of fragmentation from within. Reports from the period suggest that strategic calculations increasingly favored negotiation over prolonged confrontation. The cumulative weight of international attention, domestic offensives, and internal dissent narrowed the space within which his organization could operate with impunity. While his network had demonstrated remarkable resilience for decades, the environment was becoming less permissive. Enforcement strategies were improving. Regional cooperation was strengthening incrementally, and alternative production zones elsewhere in the world were altering global supply patterns. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded his mountain strongholds began to erode. Eventually, a pivotal transition occurred when Khun Sa reached an arrangement with the Myanmar government in the mid-1990s. Under this agreement, he surrendered and effectively dissolved the Mong Thai army as an independent armed force. In return, he was permitted to relocate and live under conditions that observers described as comparatively comfortable, though no longer as a commanding warlord. This outcome reflected the pragmatic realities facing all sides. For the government, neutralizing a high-profile figure reduced international pressure and stabilized part of Shan's state. For Khun Sa, it preserved personal security and a measure of wealth while avoiding the uncertainties of continued armed struggle. The dissolution of his militia did not instantly eliminate opium production in the region, but it marked the end of an era in which a single individual was widely portrayed as dominating the Golden Triangle's narcotics trade. The aftermath revealed the structural depth of the opium economy. Even with his withdrawal, cultivation persisted in various forms, driven by economic incentives and local conditions. This continuity underscored a central lesson of the Golden Triangle experience. While charismatic leaders and powerful militias can shape trafficking networks, the underlying drivers of production are embedded in geography, poverty, and political marginalization. Removing one dominant figure alters the configuration of power but does not automatically dismantle the system that sustained it. Khun Sa's negotiated exit illustrated both the limits and possibilities of enforcement within conflict-affected regions. By the end of his active career, the image of an untouchable warlord commanding a vast narcotics empire had given way to a more complex legacy. He had demonstrated how a combination of military organization, strategic alliances, and geographic advantage could translate into influence over global supply chains. At the same time, his eventual accommodation with state authorities revealed the constraints imposed by shifting political landscapes and sustained international scrutiny. The story of his mid-career struggles and strategic recalibrations highlights the interplay between force and negotiation, between illicit enterprise and political identity, and between local realities and global consequences. As this second phase concludes, the Golden Triangle stands as a testament to how deeply narcotics economies can intertwine with insurgency and statecraft, and how dismantling such networks demands not only tactical operations, but long-term structural change that addresses the roots of instability and economic dependency. As part one of this exploration concludes, the foundations of Khun Sa's ascent stand clear: a volatile borderland, a valuable crop, an organized militia, and a leader who understood how to navigate the space between rebellion and negotiation. In the next phase of his story, these elements would be tested by intensified crackdowns, internal fractures, and evolving regional dynamics that would ultimately challenge the durability of his control over the Golden Triangle's opium economy. When Khun Sa stepped away from direct command and his militia was dissolved under the arrangement that allowed him to live out his remaining years without continued armed confrontation, many observers wondered whether the era he represented had truly ended or merely transformed into something less visible but equally complex. His withdrawal from frontline leadership did not erase decades of influence, nor did it instantly dismantle the structures that had enabled the Golden Triangle to become one of the most significant opium-producing regions in the world. Instead, his departure marked a transition from a period dominated by a single highly visible warlord to a more fragmented landscape in which power dispersed among multiple actors, each operating within the constraints and opportunities created by shifting political realities. To understand the lasting significance of Khun Sa's rise and fall, it is necessary to look beyond the dramatic image of mountain strongholds and armed convoys and examine the deeper forces that allowed such a figure to emerge in the first place, because his story was never only about one man, but about a region shaped by geography, conflict, and global demand. The Golden Triangle's terrain remained as rugged as ever, its steep hills and dense forests continuing to challenge governance and enforcement long after Khun Sa relinquished control of his army. For generations, these landscapes had offered both isolation and opportunity. Isolation limited the reach of centralized administration, making it difficult to build infrastructure, deliver services, or enforce uniform laws. Opportunity arose from the suitability of high-altitude climates for opium poppy cultivation, a crop that required relatively little bulk to transport, yet commanded high value in distant markets. Even as international agencies intensified crop substitution programs and regional governments strengthened cooperation, the fundamental economic calculus for many farmers did not shift overnight. In remote villages where alternative livelihoods were uncertain and transportation networks underdeveloped, opium remained an attractive option despite eradication campaigns and legal risks. Khun Sa had capitalized on these conditions by providing protection, guaranteed purchase, and a semblance of order, and while his personal authority disappeared, the underlying incentives persisted. The fragmentation that followed his negotiated settlement introduced a new dynamic into the narcotics landscape. Without a single dominant militia controlling large swaths of territory, smaller groups and networks competed or cooperated in more fluid arrangements. This diffusion of power complicated enforcement in different ways. Whereas previously authorities could concentrate attention on a highly visible central figure, now they faced a mosaic of actors less susceptible to singular targeting. The absence of one commanding warlord did not necessarily equate to a dramatic decline in production. Instead, it shifted the configuration of influence and required more nuanced strategies. For policymakers and analysts, this transition reinforced a lesson that had been evident throughout Khun Sa's career. Durable solutions in conflict-affected borderlands must address governance gaps, economic marginalization, and regional political complexities, rather than focusing exclusively on individual personalities. Khun Sa himself spent his later years away from the battlefield, reportedly residing in relative comfort within Myanmar until his death in 2007. His personal trajectory, from commanding thousands of armed fighters to living under a negotiated arrangement, illustrated the pragmatic calculations that can shape outcomes in protracted conflicts. He had once been described in international media as a central figure in global opium supply, a symbol of the Golden Triangle's dominance in heroin markets. Yet the end of his active career did not unfold through a dramatic capture or military defeat, but through negotiation, reflecting the interplay between force and accommodation that characterized much of the region's history. This resolution, while controversial to some observers who questioned the leniency of the terms, underscored the broader political context in which stability sometimes took precedence over punitive measures. Evaluating his legacy requires balancing multiple perspectives. On one hand, his organization contributed significantly to a narcotics economy that had profound global consequences, fueling addiction, crime, and public health crises far beyond Southeast Asia. The heroin that flowed from the Golden Triangle during the height of his influence entered markets across continents, linking remote mountain villages to urban centers thousands of miles away. On the other hand, within the context of Shan State's complex political landscape, he was also perceived by some supporters as a defender of local interests against a distant central government. These dual perceptions complicated both domestic and international responses, illustrating how figures embedded in insurgent or semi-insurgent environments can occupy roles that defy simple categorization. The global dimension of his story highlights the interconnected nature of modern illicit economies. Demand in consumer countries, supply in remote agricultural regions, and transit through porous borders form a chain in which disruptions at one point can reverberate across the entire system. During the decades of Khun Sa's prominence, international drug control efforts increasingly recognized the necessity of cross-border cooperation, intelligence sharing, and long-term development initiatives. Yet the Golden Triangle experience demonstrated that enforcement alone cannot resolve issues rooted in poverty, political exclusion, and geographic isolation. Where state presence is weak and alternative opportunities scarce, illicit economies can entrench themselves with remarkable resilience. Khun Sa's ability to command loyalty and maintain territorial control for so many years was inseparable from these structural realities. In the years following his withdrawal, shifts in global production patterns further reshaped the narcotics landscape. Other regions rose or declined in relative importance, influenced by conflict dynamics, eradication campaigns, and market demand. The Golden Triangle remained a notable production area, but it no longer carried the singular prominence it once held during the peak of Khun Sa's era. This evolution underscores how illicit markets are adaptive systems, responding to pressure by relocating, fragmenting, or innovating. The decline of one dominant figure does not signal the end of the trade. Rather, it marks a phase in an ongoing cycle shaped by economic incentives and regulatory efforts. For historians and analysts, Khun Sa's story provides a case study in how non-state armed actors can leverage illicit commodities to finance territorial control and political leverage. His model combined military organization, strategic alliances, economic management, and media engagement in a way that blurred conventional distinctions between insurgency and organized crime. By granting interviews and articulating political narratives, he sought to influence international perception even as authorities pursued him. This interplay between image and operation reveals the importance of narrative in conflicts tied to illicit economies. Leaders who frame their activities within broader political grievances can complicate external efforts to isolate them purely as criminal actors. At the same time, the eventual settlement that ended his command demonstrates the limits of such strategies when confronted with sustained pressure and shifting alliances. The endurance of opium cultivation in parts of the Golden Triangle after his departure also highlights the importance of sustainable development initiatives. Programs aimed at crop substitution require more than seeds and training. They demand infrastructure, market access, education, healthcare, and long-term investment that builds trust between communities and the state. Without these foundations, eradication can exacerbate hardship and inadvertently reinforce the appeal of illicit networks promising protection and income. Khun Sa's era illustrated how deeply intertwined economic survival and security concerns can become in marginalized regions. Addressing one dimension without the other risks perpetuating cycles of instability. Reflecting on his life invites broader consideration of how global demand shapes local realities. Consumers far removed from the mountains of Southeast Asia influence the profitability of poppy cultivation, just as policy decisions in distant capitals affected enforcement priorities and diplomatic engagement. The Golden Triangle's integration into global heroin markets was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a transnational system linking producers, traffickers, intermediaries, and consumers. Khun Sa's prominence within that system symbolized the capacity of individuals operating in remote areas to exert influence on a worldwide scale when structural conditions align in their favor. His story, therefore, serves as both a historical narrative and a cautionary example of how geography, conflict, and economic disparity can converge to create powerful, illicit networks. Ultimately, the era of Khun Sa underscores that combating entrenched narcotics economies requires patience, coordination, and a willingness to address underlying political and social drivers. Military offensives, intelligence operations, and diplomatic pressure all played roles in constraining his influence. But it was the gradual reshaping of regional political dynamics and negotiated settlements that concluded his direct command. Even then, the persistence of cultivation in various forms demonstrated that systemic challenges outlive individual actors. His life traced an arc from emerging militia leader in a fragmented post-independence landscape to internationally recognized warlord associated with a significant share of global opium supply, and finally to a negotiated retiree whose departure symbolized both change and continuity. In examining this trajectory, one sees not only the rise and fall of a single figure, but the broader evolution of the Golden Triangle and the global drug trade during the late 20th century. The mountains that once sheltered his strongholds remain, as do the lessons drawn from decades of struggle over territory, governance, and illicit commerce. His legacy endures as a reminder that when state authority is limited, economic alternatives scarce, and global demand strong, powerful networks can emerge from the margins and shape events far beyond their immediate surroundings. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.